Welcome, history enthusiasts. You're watching History Teller Whitey, where we bring the past to life in vivid detail. Today, we're diving deep into one of the most dramatic moments in naval history, the Spanish Armada of 1588. Picture this: over 130 Spanish ships, carrying more than 30,000 men, setting sail to invade England, facing storms, strategic English fire ships, and the cunning leadership of Queen Elizabeth I. From massive battles in the English Channel to deadly storms off the coasts of Scotland and Ireland, this is a story of strategy, courage, ambition, and survival. In this video, we're not just recounting events. We're exploring the intelligence networks, ship designs, leadership decisions, psychological warfare, and the lasting impact that changed the course of history. Stay tuned, because every twist and turn of the Armada's journey will leave you on the edge of your seat. And by the end, you'll understand why this moment reshaped Europe and the world forever. By the late 16th century, Europe was a continent simmering with religious tension, political rivalry, and imperial ambition. The Protestant Reformation had reshaped nations, sowing both religious fervor and discord. In England, Queen Elizabeth I, a Protestant, had consolidated power after decades of religious upheaval. Her leadership was cautious yet decisive, balancing diplomacy and military readiness. Across the Channel, Spain, under the staunchly Catholic King Philip II, was a formidable empire stretching across Europe and the Americas. Spain viewed Protestant England as both a theological threat and a challenge to its expanding global influence. The stage was set for conflict, fueled by decades of intermittent skirmishes, privateering raids, and political antagonism. English privateers, sanctioned by Elizabeth, had been attacking Spanish treasure ships returning from the Americas, further inflaming tensions. Meanwhile, Spain's domination of European waters seemed unchallenged, and Philip II began to consider the unthinkable: a massive invasion of England to restore Catholicism and reaffirm Spain's supremacy. This ideological and political friction would ultimately erupt into one of the most famous naval confrontations in history. Queen Elizabeth I, often remembered as the Virgin Queen, had a reputation for intelligence, pragmatism, and charisma. She understood the stakes of facing the Spanish Armada and took extraordinary steps to strengthen England's defenses. She invested in the Navy, commissioning faster, more maneuverable ships, while also reorganizing the army and coastal militias. Her speeches to Parliament and public declarations inspired national unity, emphasizing the defense of English freedom and Protestant faith. Elizabeth was not just a political figurehead. She was a master strategist who recognized that psychological and symbolic power were as important as military strength. Her decision-making was meticulous, from funding campaigns to encouraging privateers to harass Spanish fleets. As England prepared, ordinary citizens were drawn into the narrative of national survival, from fishermen assisting in coastal patrols to townspeople volunteering for watch duties. This period of preparation forged a sense of English identity and resilience that would play a critical role when the Armada eventually arrived. King Philip II of Spain, on the other hand, was determined to expand Catholic influence across Europe and eliminate the Protestant threat posed by Elizabeth's England. He assembled one of the largest naval forces of the era, intending to transport a massive army from the Spanish Netherlands to invade England. Philip's plan was both audacious and complex. The Armada would sail from Spain, rendezvous with the Duke of Parma's troops in the Low Countries, and then launch an amphibious assault on the southern coast of England. To execute this strategy, Spain marshaled over 130 ships and 30,000 men, including soldiers, sailors, and support personnel. The Armada was armed with powerful cannons, reflecting Spain's naval superiority at the time. However, Philip faced challenges in logistics, coordination, and weather unpredictability. His advisors cautioned him about the risks, Yet Philip's determination and desire to assert Catholic dominance overrode their concerns. As preparations intensified, Europe held its breath, witnessing the buildup of what would become one of history's most legendary maritime campaigns. In May 1588, the Spanish Armada began its journey from the port of Lisbon, Portugal, under the command of the seasoned admiral, the Duke of Medina Sidonia. This fleet represented the pinnacle of Spain's naval ambition. Over 130 ships carrying nearly 30,000 men, including sailors, soldiers, and support crews. Every vessel was meticulously loaded with weapons, ammunition, and provisions, reflecting Philip II's desire for absolute precision. However, the Armada's size also created vulnerabilities. Managing such a massive fleet posed enormous logistical challenges. Maintaining coordination, keeping morale high, and ensuring supplies for the journey across the treacherous waters of the Bay of Biscay were monumental tasks. Meanwhile, news of the Armada's departure reached England quickly. Elizabeth I and her council had been monitoring Spanish activity for months, understanding that a confrontation was inevitable. English spies had reported on the Armada's size and intended route, and England's navy, though smaller, was more agile and familiar with local waters. The tension across both nations was palpable. Citizens along the southern coast of England were warned to prepare, militias were mobilized, and coastal defenses reinforced. The European world watched anxiously as two superpowers in ideology and empire prepared for a collision that could alter the course of history. Life aboard the Armada was grueling and often perilous. Sailors and soldiers endured cramped conditions, poor hygiene, and limited food, which deteriorated over weeks of travel. Disease spread quickly in such confined quarters, and the psychological strain of waiting for battle in a foreign sea was immense. The fleet's officers struggled to maintain discipline among men who were both excited by the prospect of glory and terrified of failure. Weather conditions further compounded difficulties. The Atlantic waters were unpredictable, with storms capable of wreaking havoc on even the most robust vessels. Coordination between ships was also challenging. Communication relied on flags, signals, and messengers, which were often inadequate in rough seas. Despite these obstacles, the Armada moved steadily northward toward the English Channel, its presence a looming threat that hung over England like a dark cloud. On the English side, Elizabeth's naval commanders understood that every day the Armada spent at sea increased the chances of its failure. They used hit-and-run tactics, leveraging their smaller, faster ships to harass Spanish vessels, forcing them into formation and slowing their progress. These early maneuvers would foreshadow the intense cat-and-mouse naval encounters that lay ahead. England's strength in the upcoming confrontation was not merely in ships and guns, but in intelligence and strategic foresight. Elizabeth's advisors, particularly Sir Francis Walsingham, her spymaster, had built an extensive network of informants across Europe. Information about the Armada's composition, armament, and intended route allowed England to anticipate Spanish movements. Admiral Lord Charles Howard and Sir Francis Drake prepared the English fleet for a war of attrition. The strategy was clear: avoid a direct clash where Spanish firepower could dominate, instead harassing and isolating enemy ships, using speed, maneuverability, and superior knowledge of the local waters. Coastal towns were ready to provide supplies, and militias were placed at key landing points in case the Spanish attempted a beach invasion. England's focus on preparedness, morale, and strategic patience highlighted Elizabeth I's genius in combining statecraft with military planning. The psychological impact of these preparations on both nations cannot be overstated. While the Spanish officers were confident in their numerical and technological superiority, they underestimated the resolve and adaptability of the English defenders. The stage was set for a confrontation that would test leadership, endurance, and the very limits of naval warfare in the 16th century. By late July 1588, the Spanish Armada had navigated the treacherous waters of the Bay of Biscay and was approaching the English Channel. The fleet, though massive and imposing, was beginning to show signs of strain. The sailors and soldiers, weakened by weeks at sea, faced fatigue, disease, and dwindling supplies. Despite the meticulous planning of Philip II, the reality of managing over 130 ships in rough waters was daunting. English scouts and fast ships shadowed the Armada's movements, relaying information back to the southern English coast. Queen Elizabeth and her council watched these reports with keen interest, understanding that the next few days could determine the fate of England. The Armada's commanders, led by the Duke of Medina Sidonia, were under immense pressure. Their instructions were clear: rendezvous with the Duke of Parma's army in the Low Countries and prepare for an invasion. However, delays, miscommunications, and the unpredictability of weather began to erode their confidence. As the Armada entered the narrow waters of the English Channel, the Spanish fleet became vulnerable to attack, and the English Navy prepared to exploit this advantage. The psychological tension was enormous. Both sides understood that the coming battle would not merely be a clash of ships, but a test of national endurance, leadership, and faith. As the Armada sailed down the Channel, it encountered the first of several English attacks. Smaller, faster English ships, commanded by figures such as Sir Francis Drake, used superior maneuverability and knowledge of local waters to harass the massive Spanish vessels. Fire ships, vessels set ablaze and sent into the Armada's formation, caused panic among the tightly packed Spanish ships. Many crews cut anchor lines hastily, breaking formation and leaving ships vulnerable to English cannon fire. These early skirmishes demonstrated the strategic ingenuity of the English commanders. They avoided direct, large-scale confrontation, instead using speed, deception, and ranged artillery to chip away at Spanish cohesion. The Duke of Medina Sidonia struggled to maintain order, but morale among Spanish troops was beginning to falter. Communication difficulties, coupled with the growing fear of unpredictable storms in the Channel, made coordination almost impossible. Despite their numerical superiority, the Spanish fleet faced an enemy that combined tactical innovation with unyielding resolve. These initial encounters set the tone for a campaign where discipline, ingenuity, and adaptability would be as important as raw firepower. The pressure on both sides reached its peak as the Armada moved deeper into English waters. For Queen Elizabeth, the sight of Spanish ships off the coast was a symbol of both danger and opportunity. She remained a figurehead of confidence, delivering speeches and giving orders that bolstered national morale. English commanders carefully monitored the Armada's movements, adjusting their tactics to exploit every weakness. Meanwhile, Medina Sidonia faced criticism from his own officers, who doubted his ability to carry out Philip II's complex plan. He had been chosen more for his noble lineage than battlefield experience, and the challenge of coordinating a fleet of such scale in hostile waters exposed his limitations. Storms, miscommunication, and the relentless English harassment further tested the resolve of the Spanish commanders and crews. Every day at sea became a battle not only with the enemy, but with fatigue, fear, and uncertainty. This critical juncture in the campaign highlighted the human dimension of warfare. Leadership, courage, and morale often mattered as much as cannons and ships. The coming days promised to be decisive, with the balance of power in Europe hanging by a thread as the Armada pressed on toward its ill-fated rendezvous. As the Spanish Armada approached the southern coast of England, their first significant challenge emerged near Plymouth. The Armada had been delayed and scattered by storms, creating confusion among its commanders. The English Navy, aware of the fleet's disorganization, seized the opportunity to launch an initial offensive. Smaller English ships, faster and more maneuverable, engaged Spanish vessels with long-range cannon fire, avoiding direct boarding encounters that favored the heavily armed Spanish galleons. The psychological impact on the Spanish crews was profound. Soldiers accustomed to ordered formations and direct confrontation were suddenly facing an enemy who attacked unpredictably and withdrew before counterattacks could be executed. The English exploited the narrow channels and shallow waters, maneuvering with precision while avoiding the risk of being trapped by larger Spanish ships. Plymouth became the stage for a series of skirmishes that tested the Armada's cohesion. The fleet struggled to maintain its intended course for rendezvous with the Duke of Parma's forces, and early casualties, damage to ships, and rising frustration among commanders threatened the campaign's overall success. Meanwhile, on the English side, the victories, though limited, inspired confidence, reinforcing the perception that England's defenses and naval strategy were superior, despite the overwhelming size of the Spanish Armada. One of the most dramatic moments of the confrontation came when the English deployed fire ships, vessels set ablaze and sent into the Armada's anchored formation. On the night of August 7th, the fire ships caused panic. Spanish captains cut anchor cables in haste, breaking formation and creating chaos among the fleet. Some ships collided, others drifted into the shallows, and many lost vital positioning required for the planned coordination with the Duke of Parma's army. The fire ships were not intended to sink large Spanish galleons but to disrupt formations, force the enemy into vulnerable positions, and reduce morale. The tactic was devastatingly effective, showing how psychological warfare and innovative strategy could compensate for smaller numbers. Sailors aboard the Spanish ships witnessed the sudden flames and chaos and feared imminent destruction. Commands were shouted, orders misinterpreted, and the fleet's disciplined organization began to unravel. The Armada had to regroup quickly, but the English fleet continued to shadow and harass, using cannon fire to inflict further damage on ships still trying to regain order. The combination of English artillery, mobility, and cunning tactics had begun to undermine Spain's initial advantage, proving that naval supremacy was not guaranteed by size alone. The disarray caused by storms, the English skirmishes, and the fire ship attack set the stage for the decisive encounter at Gravelines. The Armada's leadership understood that time was critical. They had to regroup, maintain cohesion, and secure passage to the Low Countries. However, fatigue, damaged ships, and declining morale had taken their toll. English commanders, including Lord Charles Howard and Sir Francis Drake, had anticipated this moment. They prepared a concentrated assault, aiming to prevent the Armada from forming its intended defensive crescent formation, which was vital for protecting transports carrying Spanish troops. As dawn approached on August 8, 1588, the two fleets were poised for a confrontation that would define the campaign. For the Spanish, the stakes could not have been higher. Success meant potential domination of England, the spread of Catholicism, and the expansion of Spanish influence. Failure, however, promised disaster, potentially altering the balance of power in Europe. Both sides understood that the coming battle would demand courage, endurance, and tactical brilliance. The calm before the storm belied the chaos that would erupt at Gravelines, where strategy, skill, and the caprices of nature would decide the fate of empires. As dawn broke on August 8, 1588, the English and Spanish fleets faced each other near Gravelines, a stretch along the northern coast of France. The Spanish Armada, though large and imposing, was weakened from the journey through the Atlantic and the English Channel. Damage from storms, fire ships, and previous skirmishes had disrupted the cohesion of the fleet. The Spanish sought to form their traditional crescent-shaped defensive formation, which allowed concentrated cannon fire to protect the transport vessels carrying the Duke of Parma's army. However, the Armada's cohesion had been shattered, and many ships struggled to maintain position. On the English side, Admiral Lord Charles Howard and Sir Francis Drake had devised a strategy that exploited the weaknesses in Spanish formation. Their smaller, more maneuverable ships circled the larger galleons, using long-range artillery to inflict maximum damage while avoiding direct boarding actions, which would have favored the Spanish soldiers. Morale aboard the English vessels was high, spurred by years of preparation and the confidence in superior tactics. Both fleets understood the stakes. For Spain, success would open the door for invasion and the restoration of Catholic rule in England. For England, victory would secure independence, faith, and sovereignty. Tension hung in the air, the calm waters of the North Sea masking the chaos and destruction about to unfold. The battle began with a thunderous exchange of cannon fire, echoing across the channel. Spanish galleons, though heavily armed, struggled to bring their cannons to bear against the fast-moving English ships. English artillery, lighter and more maneuverable, inflicted damage quickly before withdrawing out of reach. The tide and wind played a crucial role, favoring the smaller English vessels. Smoke from the cannons, combined with fires aboard damaged ships, created a scene of confusion and panic within the Armada. Many Spanish captains struggled to relay orders, and some vessels collided while trying to maneuver, exacerbating the disarray. The English fleet employed hit-and-run tactics, isolating ships from the main formation and concentrating fire to disable key vessels. Spanish soldiers, trained for boarding actions, were frustrated as they were unable to engage the English ships in close combat. For hours, the battle raged, with the Armada unable to regain its intended formation. The strategic advantage of the English Navy, speed, maneuverability, and knowledge of the local waters, began to turn the tide against Spain. The psychological impact on the Spanish crews was severe. Fear and confusion spread, undermining confidence in their commander's ability to lead effectively. By late afternoon, the Battle of Gravelines had reached a turning point. The Spanish Armada, unable to regroup and maintain its defensive formation, faced mounting losses. Several galleons were destroyed or badly damaged, and the soldiers on board were exhausted, injured, or demoralized. Recognizing the futility of pressing the attack, Admiral Medina Sidonia made the critical decision to retreat. The plan to rendezvous with the Duke of Parma's army was now impossible, and the fleet had no choice but to head north, attempting to sail around Scotland and Ireland to return to Spain. The English, though victorious, did not pursue the retreating ships aggressively, aware of the dangers of overextending into unfamiliar waters. The battle had demonstrated the power of strategic innovation over sheer numbers and firepower. For Spain, the retreat marked a humiliating failure, shaking confidence in Philip II's leadership and diminishing the aura of invincibility surrounding the Spanish Navy. England, meanwhile, celebrated a remarkable victory, with morale and national pride soaring. The Battle of Gravelines would go down in history as a turning point, where skill, strategy, and resilience overcame formidable odds, altering the balance of power in Europe and securing England's place on the world stage. After the devastating confrontation at Gravelines, the Spanish Armada faced a grim reality. The plan to join forces with the Duke of Parma's army was no longer viable. With ships damaged and morale plummeting, Admiral Medina Sidonia ordered a retreat, steering the fleet northward around the coasts of Scotland and Ireland. This decision, though necessary, exposed the Armada to one of the harshest maritime environments in Europe. The North Atlantic, notorious for treacherous currents, unpredictable storms, and icy waters, posed a deadly challenge to the fleet. Many ships had already sustained damage from previous battles, leaving them vulnerable to the rough seas. Crews faced freezing temperatures, relentless waves, and limited food supplies, making survival as urgent a concern as navigation. Sailors who had survived the intense cannon exchanges now had to contend with a natural enemy far greater than any English galleon: the sea itself. Navigation errors, compounded by exhaustion and fear, caused many ships to run aground on rocky coasts or become stranded in shallow waters. The psychological toll was immense. Sailors and soldiers, already demoralized by defeat, witnessed comrades lost to storms and wrecks. The retreat became less a tactical maneuver than a desperate struggle for survival, highlighting the brutal realities of naval warfare in the 16th century. As the Armada navigated the northern coasts, disaster struck repeatedly. Violent storms scattered the fleet, and numerous ships were wrecked on the rocky shores of Scotland and Ireland. Hundreds of men drowned, while others succumbed to hypothermia or starvation. The English had little direct involvement in this phase of the retreat, but the natural obstacles proved more lethal than any cannonball. Reports from survivors described ships torn apart by waves, hulls battered and flooded, and desperate crews clinging to fragments of wreckage. Local populations in Scotland and Ireland witnessed the aftermath, with washed-up debris and bodies strewn along the coastline. These tragedies, combined with the inability to regroup effectively, further eroded the Armada's fighting capability. Meanwhile, morale among the remaining Spanish forces was shattered. Soldiers who had survived battles with the English now faced a new enemy, the unrelenting fury of nature. The retreat around Scotland and Ireland, originally intended as a safe passage home, became a catastrophic ordeal, reducing the once proud Armada to a shadow of its former strength. The human cost was staggering, with thousands perishing due to the combination of battle damage, storms, and deprivation. The catastrophic retreat highlighted the limitations of even the most powerful fleets when confronted with both human error and the forces of nature. Admiral Medina Sidonia's leadership, though constrained by circumstance, was tested to its extreme limits. The coordination failures and decision-making challenges experienced during the retreat underscored the difficulty of managing a massive fleet in hostile waters. On the Spanish side, King Philip II had underestimated the risks of weather, overestimated his commander's ability to maintain cohesion, and misjudged the strategic acumen of the English Navy. For England, the Armada's retreat reinforced the effectiveness of a strategy that combined intelligence, maneuverability, and indirect pressure. Rather than seeking to annihilate the Spanish fleet outright, the English had exploited natural conditions and tactical innovation to achieve a decisive victory. The retreat around Scotland and Ireland marked the beginning of the end for the Armada's mission and became a symbol of the vulnerability of even the most formidable military forces when faced with the unpredictable forces of nature and the resilience of a well-prepared opponent. The episode would be remembered for centuries as a lesson in strategy, leadership, and the indomitable spirit of nations facing overwhelming threats. The defeat of the Spanish Armada had profound consequences for Spain, both politically and psychologically. Philip II, who had invested enormous resources and prestige into the campaign, faced humiliation on a scale that shook the confidence of his court and military. Thousands of men were lost, ships destroyed, and the intended invasion of England had failed entirely. The Spanish public, previously assured of the invincibility of their navy, struggled to comprehend the disaster. News of the retreat and wrecks along the coasts of Scotland and Ireland reached Spain slowly, with many details emerging only after survivors returned months later. Philip's advisors debated the causes of the failure, highlighting storms, mismanagement, and underestimation of the English Navy. The loss undermined Spain's aura of military supremacy in Europe and emboldened rivals, including France, the Dutch provinces in revolt, and England itself. Morale within the Spanish military and among overseas territories also suffered, as the Armada had been intended to assert Spain's dominance not only in Europe but across the Atlantic world. Strategically, the defeat forced Philip II to reconsider his approach to naval power, invasion plans, and the broader fight against Protestant nations. While Spain remained a formidable empire, the myth of invincibility was permanently tarnished, creating ripple effects that would influence European geopolitics for decades. In contrast, England emerged from the conflict with unprecedented national pride and political capital. Queen Elizabeth I was celebrated as a masterful leader whose vision, preparation, and charisma had guided her nation through one of its most perilous moments. English commanders, particularly Lord Charles Howard and Sir Francis Drake, were hailed as heroes, their tactical brilliance and daring maneuvers reinforcing England's reputation as a rising naval power. The victory at sea became a symbol of divine favor, often interpreted in contemporary accounts as proof that Protestant England was protected by God against the might of Catholic Spain. Propaganda, including pamphlets, illustrations, and poems, spread throughout the country, emphasizing the courage of English sailors, the wisdom of Elizabeth, and the hubris of Philip II. Ordinary citizens, who had endured months of tension and preparation for a possible invasion, were galvanized by the news. The triumph strengthened national identity, unifying people across social classes under a shared sense of achievement and purpose. Militarily, the Armada's failure demonstrated the effectiveness of a smaller, agile, and strategically innovative force over a larger but less flexible fleet. England's naval doctrine evolved from these lessons, setting the stage for future dominance on the seas. The long-term consequences of the Armada's defeat extended far beyond immediate political or military considerations. For Spain, the loss was a cautionary tale about the limitations of sheer numbers, overconfidence, and underestimating the ingenuity of opponents. It forced a reevaluation of naval tactics, logistics, and the management of multinational fleets. For England, the victory had a transformative effect, signaling the rise of a maritime nation capable of defending its sovereignty and projecting power overseas. The event also had religious implications, reinforcing Protestant confidence while undermining the perception of Catholic invincibility in European affairs. In cultural memory, the Spanish Armada became an enduring symbol of resistance, strategy, and divine providence, inspiring generations of writers, artists, and historians. The campaign's lessons influenced naval warfare for decades, emphasizing speed, coordination, and tactical innovation over brute force. The defeat of the Armada thus reshaped Europe's political and religious landscape, solidifying England's emerging status as a global power and forever altering the perception of Spain's naval supremacy. Its legacy resonates not only in historical scholarship, but in national myths, propaganda, and collective memory, ensuring that the story of the Armada remains one of the most dramatic and consequential events of the 16th century. For the ordinary sailors and soldiers of the Spanish Armada, the campaign was a mixture of duty, fear, and endurance. Life aboard a galleon was harsh and unrelenting. Cramped quarters, poor ventilation, and long hours of labor made daily life exhausting even before the threat of combat. Sailors were responsible for tasks ranging from raising sails, navigating treacherous waters, and maintaining the ship's structure under constant strain. Soldiers, meanwhile, trained for boarding actions and hand-to-hand combat, often stationed in crowded areas below deck. Food and water were limited and prone to spoilage, contributing to illness and malnutrition. Disease, such as scurvy and dysentery, spread rapidly, reducing combat readiness. Psychological strain was equally formidable. Sailors faced the constant fear of enemy attacks, storms, and shipwreck. When battle approached, tension escalated to near-breaking point, with cannon fire shaking the decks, smoke choking the crew, and the screams of the injured filling the air. Many wrote in diaries or letters of the terror and confusion, painting vivid portraits of endurance and human resilience. The lives of these men were defined not only by their skills but by their capacity to survive in extreme conditions, revealing the human cost behind the grand narratives of empires and strategy. Within the chaos of the Armada's campaign, acts of heroism and tragedy were interwoven. Some sailors distinguished themselves through courage, boarding enemy vessels or manning cannons under relentless fire. Others displayed ingenuity, repairing critical damage in the midst of storms or assisting comrades despite exhaustion. Stories from the retreat around Scotland and Ireland are particularly harrowing. Men clung to wreckage, fought to stay alive in freezing waters, and scavenged for food along remote, rocky coasts. Many perished alone, their deaths unrecorded and often forgotten. Yet, these personal struggles underscore the extraordinary endurance of individuals in the face of catastrophic circumstances. Letters and survivor accounts describe the terror of waves crushing ships, the despair of losing comrades, and the fear of enemy capture or starvation. In England, sailors and soldiers faced their own risks, though their victories boosted morale and inspired national pride. For them, courage was often combined with strategic skill, as small crews maneuvered agile ships against a larger, more heavily armed enemy. The human stories on both sides reveal that history is not only about leaders and nations, but also about the experiences of those who lived, fought, and sometimes died during these pivotal moments. Beyond physical hardship, the campaign imposed an enormous psychological toll on participants. Fear, uncertainty, and the anticipation of death weighed heavily on every sailor and soldier. On the Spanish side, men who had been trained and disciplined for conventional battle were confronted by the unpredictability of English tactics, storms, and logistical chaos. Many experienced despair as ships were destroyed or drifted helplessly toward the treacherous coasts of Scotland and Ireland. Anxiety and exhaustion often led to mistakes, collisions, and panic, amplifying losses. For the English, while victory was ultimately achieved, sailors lived under constant threat of Spanish counterattacks and navigational hazards. Commanders had to manage morale carefully, encouraging courage while maintaining discipline in a dangerous environment. Letters and chronicles from the era illustrate that the mental strain was as formidable as the physical challenges, affecting decision-making, cohesion, and survival. The psychological impact of the Armada campaign demonstrates that naval warfare was not merely a contest of ships and cannons, but also a battle of endurance, resilience, and mental fortitude. These experiences, though often overshadowed by broader historical narratives, offer a window into the human cost of empire, ideology, and ambition during one of the most dramatic military confrontations of the 16th century. One of the defining elements of the Spanish Armada's failure was the unpredictable and violent weather of the North Atlantic. As the fleet retreated around Scotland and Ireland, they were battered by fierce storms that tested the limits of seamanship and endurance. Many of the Spanish galleons were already damaged from previous skirmishes, and the rough seas compounded structural weaknesses. High winds, towering waves, and freezing temperatures created near-impossible conditions for navigation. Crews struggled to maintain control of their ships, often forced to cut anchors and abandon formation to avoid capsizing. Supplies of food and fresh water were inadequate for the extended journey, and scurvy and starvation further weakened the men. Navigation errors became common, with many ships running aground or drifting off course. Historical accounts describe sailors clinging desperately to debris, trying to survive both the natural fury of the ocean and the cumulative effects of exhaustion, fear, and injury. For the Spanish, the sea became as formidable an enemy as the English fleet. The Armada's planners had underestimated the unpredictability and power of nature, a miscalculation that proved catastrophic. This episode illustrated a timeless lesson in naval warfare. Even the largest, most well-equipped fleets are vulnerable to forces beyond human control. The geography of the English Channel and surrounding waters played a crucial role in the Armada campaign. Narrow passages, shallow waters, hidden shoals, and shifting tides made navigation perilous for large ships unfamiliar with the terrain. The Spanish Armada, heavily laden with soldiers and supplies, was particularly vulnerable in these confined spaces. English commanders exploited this advantage by maneuvering smaller, faster vessels that could strike and withdraw without risk of grounding. Coastal knowledge allowed the English to anticipate currents, tidal patterns, and safe passages, giving them a tactical edge that magnified their numerical disadvantage. Conversely, the Spanish commanders struggled to maintain formation, coordinate maneuvers, and execute complex battle plans under constantly changing environmental conditions. Storms and high winds forced ships apart, leaving them isolated and easy targets for English firepower. The interplay between geography and strategy revealed that mastery of the physical environment was as crucial as artillery and manpower. It was not merely the strength of the Spanish fleet that determined the outcome, but also the way natural forces interacted with human planning, turning careful strategy into chaos. The Armada's ordeal became a testament to the power of terrain and weather in shaping the course of history. The storms, tides, and treacherous waters ultimately ensured that even the most skilled commanders could not salvage the Armada's mission. Ships that survived English attacks faced new dangers from waves, wind, and rocky shores. Many vessels sank entirely, while others were stranded or severely damaged, leaving crews to face death from exposure, hunger, or drowning. The psychological impact of this environmental assault was immense. Spanish soldiers who had already endured battle felt hopeless in the face of relentless natural forces. Commanders, including Medina Sidonia, made desperate attempts to maintain order, but the combination of fatigue, fear, and environmental hazards often rendered disciplined action impossible. The experience highlighted the unpredictable nature of maritime warfare, where human strategy must contend with elements that cannot be controlled. England's victory, therefore, was not due solely to tactical brilliance, but also to the fortunate alignment of strategy with environmental factors that magnified their advantages and exposed the weaknesses of the Spanish Armada. In historical reflection, the role of nature is emphasized repeatedly. Storms, currents, and geography shaped the campaign's outcome as much as human decisions, demonstrating that even the most ambitious military plans can be humbled by the forces of the natural world. The defeat of the Spanish Armada sent shockwaves through Europe, reshaping political dynamics and influencing the balance of power for decades. Spain, long considered the dominant military and maritime power of the continent, had suffered a humiliation that diminished its aura of invincibility. Monarchs and rulers across Europe recalculated their alliances and strategies in response to this outcome. Countries that had previously feared Spanish dominance, including England's Protestant allies and the rebellious Dutch provinces, found renewed confidence in resisting Spanish influence. The defeat demonstrated that even a powerful empire could be checked by a combination of skill, strategy, and the environment. France, though politically fragmented and religiously divided, observed the event carefully, weighing opportunities to assert influence in Northern Europe. The Armada's failure thus encouraged smaller states and emerging powers to challenge Spain's ambitions, signaling a gradual shift in European geopolitics. The notion that Spanish might was absolute was shattered, and for the first time in decades, England and its allies were viewed as a serious counterbalance to the Habsburg-led empire. Religion, which had been one of the primary motivations behind the Armada, was profoundly affected by the campaign's outcome. Philip II's mission to restore Catholic dominance in England had failed, reinforcing Protestant confidence not only in England but across Europe. The English perceived the victory as a sign of divine favor, a narrative propagated through speeches, pamphlets, and sermons that framed the Armada's defeat as a miraculous triumph for Protestant faith. For Catholics, the loss was a deeply unsettling blow, calling into question the notion of divine endorsement of Spanish authority. This religious dimension intensified existing tensions across Europe. Protestant movements, particularly in the Netherlands, were emboldened, accelerating their struggle for independence from Spanish control. Simultaneously, Catholic rulers had to reassess the risks and feasibility of military campaigns intended to enforce religious conformity, realizing that spiritual objectives alone could not overcome tactical and logistical realities. In essence, the Armada's defeat reinforced the interplay between faith and politics, demonstrating that military campaigns driven by religious zeal were vulnerable when faced with pragmatic, well-prepared, and strategically adept opposition. The aftermath of the Armada saw a flood of propaganda across Europe, shaping international perception and national identity. In England, the victory was celebrated with illustrations depicting Spanish ships in flames, poems praising Elizabeth I, and public orations lauding the courage of the English Navy. These narratives emphasized moral superiority, portraying Spain as arrogant and overreaching while highlighting English ingenuity, resilience, and divine favor. Conversely, in Spain, accounts of the campaign often blamed storms, poor leadership, and miscommunication, framing the loss as a combination of misfortune rather than incompetence. Yet, regardless of interpretation, the defeat could not be hidden, and Europe witnessed a clear demonstration that Spain's naval power could be challenged. The psychological impact on both rulers and common people was substantial. England gained prestige and credibility as a rising naval power, while Spain had to contend with the humiliation of failing to project its power as expected. Diplomats, merchants, and military leaders observed and adapted, with many recognizing that future conflicts would require not only strength and numbers but also strategy, preparation, and the ability to adapt to both human and environmental challenges. In this way, the Armada's legacy extended far beyond immediate military consequences, influencing diplomacy, alliances, and perceptions of power across the continent. One of the most significant lessons of the Armada campaign concerned the importance of ship design and maneuverability in naval warfare. The Spanish galleons, although heavily armed and sturdy, were relatively slow and cumbersome, designed primarily for boarding actions and close-range engagements. In contrast, English ships prioritized speed, agility, and maneuverability, allowing them to outflank and harass larger Spanish vessels effectively. The English design allowed for rapid repositioning, enabling smaller fleets to exploit gaps, avoid direct confrontation, and deliver concentrated artillery fire with minimal risk. The difference in ship design proved decisive in the English Channel, where confined waters and strong tides favored nimble vessels. Moreover, the campaign highlighted the limitations of traditional naval tactics when faced with innovative strategies. Armadas reliant on brute strength and close-quarter combat were vulnerable to fleets employing long-range artillery, hit-and-run maneuvers, and coordinated harassment. The campaign ultimately underscored the necessity of balancing firepower, structural durability, and speed, a lesson that influenced European naval architecture for decades and laid the groundwork for England's rise as a maritime power. The Armada also demonstrated the evolving role of artillery in naval warfare. Spanish galleons carried massive cannons designed for close-range bombardment, relying on their formation to maximize effectiveness. However, the English ships' smaller, lighter, and more accurately positioned cannons allowed them to engage from a distance, causing significant damage while minimizing risk. Firepower was no longer merely about size. Range, accuracy, and tactical deployment became critical factors. The English fleet utilized coordinated volleys to target key Spanish vessels, while maintaining mobility to avoid counterattacks. Additionally, the use of fire ships showcased how indirect methods could disrupt enemy formations without requiring direct combat. These lessons encouraged innovation in cannon design, ammunition types, and firing techniques throughout Europe. Future naval commanders increasingly recognized the importance of integrating artillery with speed and maneuvering, rather than relying solely on sheer force or numerical superiority. The Armada campaign thus marked a turning point in naval technology, where strategic use of firepower became a determining factor in maritime dominance. Beyond technology, the Armada emphasized the critical role of tactical innovation and effective command structures. The English Navy's ability to adapt quickly to environmental conditions, exploit Spanish weaknesses, and coordinate complex maneuvers reflected a sophisticated understanding of naval strategy. Centralized command, effective communication between ships, and reliance on intelligence allowed the English to anticipate Spanish movements and respond with precision. Conversely, the Spanish Armada suffered from rigid command hierarchies and miscommunication, exacerbated by unfamiliarity with local waters and stormy conditions. The inability to adapt to changing circumstances, combined with over-reliance on traditional formations, rendered the fleet vulnerable. These tactical lessons influenced naval doctrine across Europe, emphasizing flexibility, initiative, and the integration of intelligence and reconnaissance into operational planning. Commanders learned that victory depended not only on numbers and firepower, but also on leadership, coordination, and the capacity to innovate under pressure. The Armada campaign thus became a seminal case study in the evolution of naval warfare, shaping the strategies, technologies, and training of European navies for generations to come. Queen Elizabeth I's leadership played a crucial role in England's successful defense against the Spanish Armada. Unlike Philip II, whose directives were often rigid and based on overconfidence, Elizabeth demonstrated a remarkable balance of strategic vision, political savvy, and morale building. She understood that victory required not only skilled commanders but also the unity and resilience of her people. Elizabeth personally inspected coastal defenses, oversaw the mobilization of militias, and coordinated with advisors like Lord Charles Howard and Sir Francis Drake to devise tactics that leveraged England's strengths: smaller, faster ships, and superior knowledge of local waters. Beyond military strategy, Elizabeth used diplomacy and intelligence to anticipate Spanish movements. Her spymaster, Sir Francis Walsingham, had an extensive network of agents across Europe who provided early warnings of the Armada's intentions. Elizabeth's speeches and public appearances inspired confidence among citizens, reinforcing the notion that the monarch shared in the dangers and responsibilities of the conflict. By combining tactical oversight with morale leadership, she ensured that the English people remained vigilant, motivated, and unified, creating a psychological advantage that complemented naval superiority. Her decision-making exemplified adaptive leadership, emphasizing preparation, strategic foresight, and the ability to inspire both officers and ordinary citizens. In contrast, the Duke of Medina Sidonia, commander of the Spanish Armada, faced an almost impossible task. Largely inexperienced in maritime warfare, he was chosen more for his noble status than naval expertise. Despite being diligent and disciplined, he confronted multiple challenges that tested his leadership at every turn. The fleet's immense size made coordination incredibly difficult, particularly when facing unpredictable weather and a nimble English fleet. Medina Sidonia struggled to maintain formation during storms and after the disruptive fire ship attacks, and miscommunications further exacerbated the disarray. He adhered strictly to Philip II's complex plans, which required rendezvous with the Duke of Parma's army, a strategy that became increasingly unrealistic as environmental and logistical factors came into play. His cautious decision-making, while understandable given the circumstances, often appeared indecisive to officers and soldiers, eroding morale. The campaign exposed the limitations of hierarchical leadership when adaptability was essential. While Medina Sidonia showed personal courage and attempted to maintain order, the Armada's failures highlighted how even a loyal, disciplined commander could be overwhelmed by environmental challenges, rigid planning, and the ingenuity of the opponent. The contrast between Elizabeth I and Medina Sidonia provides enduring lessons in leadership and decision-making. Elizabeth exemplified adaptive, multifaceted leadership, combining strategic foresight, effective delegation, intelligence utilization, and the ability to inspire her people. She understood the importance of morale, flexibility, and leveraging the strengths of her forces, creating a resilient and innovative defense. Medina Sidonia, by contrast, illustrates the dangers of rigid command structures, reliance on overwhelming numbers, and underestimation of environmental and human factors. Both leaders faced uncertainty, but the outcomes underscore the value of adaptability, communication, and the capacity to respond dynamically to evolving challenges. The campaign demonstrates that leadership is not merely about authority or rank, but about vision, decision-making under pressure, and the ability to align human and material resources effectively. Historians continue to study these contrasting approaches as examples of how leadership can determine the outcome of monumental historical events, influencing not only immediate military results, but the trajectory of national and international history. The defeat of the Spanish Armada quickly became a central theme in English cultural memory, celebrated through literature, art, and public commemoration. Poets, playwrights, and chroniclers depicted the victory as a combination of divine providence and human ingenuity. The Armada was often portrayed as a monstrous force, formidable in size but ultimately defeated by the cleverness and courage of English sailors. Artists produced dramatic illustrations of flaming Spanish ships, turbulent seas, and heroic English commanders, reinforcing the narrative of moral and strategic superiority. Public performances and ceremonies commemorated the event, with Elizabeth I herself depicted as a heroic and almost divine figure, rallying her people to defend the nation. These depictions served not only as celebration but as propaganda, reinforcing national identity and unifying the English populace under the symbolism of Protestant resilience and divine favor. Literature and art elevated the Armada's defeat beyond a military victory, turning it into a story of national destiny and moral triumph, inspiring pride across generations and embedding the event deeply into England's cultural and historical consciousness. In Spain, cultural memory of the Armada was more complex and often tinged with tragedy, reflection, and rationalization. Chronicles and accounts written in the aftermath focused on misfortune, emphasizing storms, logistical difficulties, and bad luck as key factors in the defeat. Artists depicted the loss with solemnity, highlighting the heroism and endurance of Spanish sailors and soldiers rather than shame. The Armada became a cautionary tale of the limits of power, the dangers of overambition, and the unpredictability of nature. Literature and memorials stressed loyalty, courage, and sacrifice, framing the event as a noble struggle rather than a complete failure. These narratives shaped the Spanish collective memory, instilling a sense of humility and caution in military planning, while also preserving national pride in the face of adversity. For both Spain and England, the Armada became more than a historical event. It was a lens through which identity, power, and moral values were interpreted and communicated, demonstrating the powerful role of cultural memory in shaping the understanding of history. Beyond Spain and England, the Armada's defeat influenced broader European and global perceptions. Across Protestant Europe, it became a symbol of the resilience of smaller powers against dominant empires, inspiring resistance movements in the Netherlands and Scandinavia. Catholic nations interpreted the loss cautiously, reevaluating military ambitions and the limits of centralized authority. News of the Armada traveled across Europe, shaping diplomatic relations and influencing the calculations of monarchs, generals, and merchants alike. Globally, the event reinforced the growing perception of England as an emerging maritime power, capable of defending its territory and projecting influence. Over the centuries, the Armada has been represented in history books, folklore, and popular culture as both a cautionary tale of hubris and a testament to strategic ingenuity. Its legacy demonstrates the interplay between historical fact and interpretation, illustrating how events can be memorialized to serve national, religious, and ideological narratives. By embedding itself in literature, art, and popular imagination, the Spanish Armada became more than a naval campaign. It became a story of human courage, divine providence, and the relentless impact of history on cultural identity. One of the most decisive yet often overlooked aspects of England's defense against the Spanish Armada was the sophisticated intelligence network orchestrated by Sir Francis Walsingham, Elizabeth I's spymaster. Walsingham recognized that victory depended not only on ships, cannons, and tactics, but also on timely and accurate information. His network of agents, informants, and double agents extended across Europe, from the Spanish Netherlands to the heart of Spain itself. These operatives collected details about armada movements, fleet composition, supply shortages, and strategic plans, relaying crucial intelligence back to England. Coded letters, intercepted messages, and reports from sympathetic insiders allowed English commanders to anticipate Spanish maneuvers, position their ships advantageously, and exploit weaknesses in the enemy's formation. Walsingham's system also engaged in counterintelligence, feeding misinformation to the Spanish and creating uncertainty within their command. The effectiveness of this intelligence network provided England with a critical edge, enabling proactive decisions rather than reactive responses. Without such precise and timely information, the Armada could have achieved greater initial success, as English ships might have been caught unprepared or mispositioned. The campaign demonstrates that intelligence is as critical to military strategy as manpower and technology, and Walsingham's network remains a remarkable example of early modern espionage at its most sophisticated and effective. The use of codes and ciphers played a crucial role in ensuring secure communication during the Armada campaign. Spanish and English commanders alike relied on coded messages to relay orders, coordinate movements, and conceal critical information from enemy interception. In England, Walsingham's network employed a combination of substitution ciphers, invisible inks, and coded letters to transmit intelligence safely. These methods allowed vital information about the Armada's composition, route, and timing to reach Elizabeth I and her naval commanders without alerting Spanish officers. Meanwhile, Spanish efforts at communication suffered from delays, misinterpretation, and vulnerability to interception. Messages had to travel long distances, often carried by dispatch boats or couriers, making timely coordination difficult, particularly in adverse weather. The contrast in communication efficiency and security significantly influenced the campaign's outcome. The English were able to act preemptively, anticipate threats, and exploit opportunities, while the Spanish struggled to adjust to changing circumstances. The campaign highlighted the emerging importance of information control, secrecy, and the use of cryptography in military strategy, setting precedents that would influence naval and land warfare for centuries. The strategic impact of espionage in the Armada campaign cannot be overstated. Accurate intelligence allowed English commanders to position their forces advantageously, select optimal engagement points, and avoid unnecessary losses. For example, knowledge of the Armada's departure, route, and intent enabled English ships to disrupt formations before the Spanish could consolidate strength. Fire ships, cannon volleys, and harassment tactics were executed with precision because commanders understood Spanish vulnerabilities. The psychological effect was also significant. Spanish officers were aware that their movements might be monitored, adding pressure and exacerbating confusion. The campaign illustrates that espionage is not merely an auxiliary element but a core component of strategic warfare. By leveraging intelligence and operational security, England was able to multiply the effectiveness of a smaller, agile fleet, demonstrating that information superiority can decisively shift the balance of power. The success of Walsingham's spy network and the intelligence-driven strategies of English commanders remain a seminal example of how foresight, secrecy, and communication mastery can determine the outcome of even the most formidable military confrontations. The Spanish Armada's very presence off the coast of England in 1588 was a formidable instrument of psychological warfare. The Armada's size, nearly 130 ships carrying over 30,000 men, projected an aura of overwhelming power designed to intimidate the English populace and government. Spanish planners intended that the sheer scale of the invasion would undermine morale, prompting surrender or weakening resistance before combat even began. Coastal towns braced for imminent attack, with civilians aware that a Spanish victory could mean a restoration of Catholic rule and potential reprisals against Protestant communities. Even seasoned English sailors and soldiers felt the pressure of facing such a massive force. The looming threat tested England's resolve, creating a psychological battlefield that extended far beyond cannon fire and hand-to-hand combat. Yet the psychological impact did not work entirely as the Spanish hoped. England's preparations, including fortified coastal defenses, civilian militias, and a capable, agile navy, mitigated fear and turned the challenge into a unifying experience. Citizens and soldiers alike drew courage from shared responsibility, rallying under the leadership of Queen Elizabeth I and her commanders. The Armada's attempt at intimidation illustrates that psychological pressure can shape the course of conflict, but its effectiveness depends on the adversary's preparation, leadership, and national resolve. England countered Spanish psychological tactics with effective morale building and propaganda. Queen Elizabeth I's speeches, public appearances, and symbolic acts of leadership emphasized courage, faith, and national unity. A famous example is her speech at Tilbury, in which she famously assured her troops that she was among them, prepared to share in their danger. This public display reinforced loyalty and confidence, transforming fear into motivation. Simultaneously, printed pamphlets, engravings, and poems circulated throughout England, celebrating naval heroism, the strategic brilliance of commanders like Drake and Howard, and the perceived favor of God in protecting the nation. These materials framed the conflict as a righteous struggle between Protestant England and Catholic Spain, portraying the Spanish as arrogant aggressors defeated not only by English skill but by divine providence. Morale building was carefully coordinated with intelligence efforts. As English forces gained accurate information about Spanish movements, confidence increased. Conversely, misinformation and disarray in the Spanish fleet amplified fear, confusion, and indecision among their crews. Psychological strategies were therefore integrated with military operations, demonstrating that warfare encompasses more than physical engagement. It involves shaping perception, influencing behavior, and exploiting vulnerabilities in morale and human psychology. On the Spanish side, the psychological toll of the campaign was immense. Spanish sailors and soldiers, accustomed to a hierarchical command structure and the expectation of success, faced constant stress from environmental hazards, innovative English tactics, and disrupted communications. Fear spread rapidly during chaotic moments, such as the fire ship attacks and the storm-laden retreat around Scotland and Ireland. Uncertainty about orders, enemy intentions, and the effectiveness of strategies created confusion that compounded material losses. Leaders, including Medina Sidonia, struggled to maintain discipline and morale, understanding that any collapse of confidence could lead to catastrophic disintegration of the fleet. For the English, controlling fear and maintaining psychological resilience was equally critical. The ability to act decisively, exploit enemy weaknesses, and remain coordinated under pressure underscored the importance of leadership in managing the human dimensions of warfare. The Armada campaign demonstrates that psychological factors, fear, morale, perception, and leadership, can decisively influence outcomes, sometimes as much as cannons, ships, or men. Mastery of these elements allowed England to convert the threat of a formidable invasion into a story of national triumph and enduring historical significance. The Spanish Armada was one of the most expensive military campaigns of the 16th century, requiring enormous financial resources that placed a heavy strain on the Spanish treasury. Philip II committed vast sums to construct, arm, and supply nearly 130 ships and to maintain an army of more than 30,000 men. The cost included not only shipbuilding and armaments, but also provisions for long voyages, salaries for sailors and soldiers, and payments to contractors and merchants across Spain and its territories. These expenses were exacerbated by delays in gathering funds from Spain's overseas colonies, particularly from silver shipments in the Americas. Inflation, piracy, and the logistical complexity of moving gold and silver across the Atlantic further complicated the financial picture. Even minor miscalculations in budgeting could have severe consequences, as shortages in food, water, or ammunition threatened both morale and operational effectiveness. The immense economic burden forced Philip to overextend the empire's resources, limiting Spain's flexibility in responding to other conflicts, particularly in the Netherlands, and making the Armada campaign a high-stakes gamble in both military and financial terms. The failure of the Armada thus not only represented a strategic and political defeat, but also a massive economic loss that reverberated across Spanish Europe and its overseas territories. Beyond funding, the logistical challenges of supplying such a massive fleet were staggering. Ships required vast quantities of food, water, ammunition, and medical supplies for long sea voyages. Yet storage was limited and conditions often led to spoilage or contamination. Coordinating supply deliveries from multiple ports, maintaining fleet cohesion, and ensuring proper provisioning of soldiers and sailors proved extremely difficult. The Armada's plan relied on a rendezvous with the Duke of Parma's army in the Spanish Netherlands. But weather, tides, and English naval interference disrupted schedules. Delays meant supplies ran low, soldiers suffered from hunger and scurvy, and crews were weakened before major engagements. The complexity of organizing convoys, coordinating departures, and synchronizing movements across hundreds of miles highlighted the intricate interplay of logistics, timing, and strategic planning. Even small errors had catastrophic consequences. A ship arriving late with essential provisions could jeopardize entire sections of the fleet. These logistical challenges were compounded by the unpredictable storms of the English Channel and the North Atlantic, which scattered the Armada and rendered carefully laid plans largely irrelevant. The campaign illustrates that successful military operations require not only superior strategy and tactics, but also meticulous attention to economic and logistical detail, as neglecting these elements can undermine even the most ambitious endeavors. Logistical challenges translated directly into human suffering during the Armada campaign. Shortages of food and water led to hunger, dehydration, and disease, weakening the fighting capability of soldiers and sailors alike. Many men perished not from enemy action but from the combination of malnutrition, illness, and exposure during long sea voyages and treacherous retreats. Hypothermia claimed lives during the storm-ravaged retreat around Scotland and Ireland, while overcrowded and unsanitary conditions below deck accelerated the spread of scurvy, dysentery, and other infectious diseases. Fatigue and frustration exacerbated tensions among crews, sometimes leading to disputes and discipline problems. The failure to deliver adequate supplies or maintain proper planning demonstrated that even well-trained and courageous forces are vulnerable when basic needs are unmet. On a broader level, the economic strain of funding the Armada affected Spain's domestic and colonial finances, undermining future campaigns and weakening Spain's position in Europe. The Armada campaign serves as a stark reminder that military success depends not only on strategy, technology, and leadership, but also on the careful management of resources and logistics, as the human and financial costs of mismanagement can be devastating. The Spanish Armada's failure had a profound and lasting impact on naval strategy across Europe. Commanders recognized that sheer numbers and firepower were insufficient without mobility, intelligence, and adaptability. The English experience demonstrated that smaller, faster ships could outmaneuver larger, more heavily armed fleets and achieve decisive results. This realization led to a shift in naval doctrine, emphasizing flexibility, reconnaissance, and the importance of controlling strategic waterways. Armies began to integrate long-range artillery tactics, coordinated fleet movements, and more sophisticated signaling systems to enhance coordination across multiple vessels. Naval strategy evolved from a reliance on boarding and close combat to a focus on maneuvering, positioning, and sustained bombardment. The Armada campaign also highlighted the critical importance of anticipating environmental factors such as tides, currents, and weather, as natural forces had a direct influence on operational success. European powers began to train naval officers in these principles, and academies emerged to teach the science of seamanship, artillery, and fleet coordination. The Armada's failure thus catalyzed a broader transformation in naval thought, shifting the balance toward strategy, skill, and innovation rather than mere size and firepower. The Armada highlighted the critical role of ship design in determining the outcome of naval engagements. Spanish galleons, while heavily armed and sturdy, were slow and cumbersome, limiting their ability to respond to agile English maneuvers. England's smaller, faster ships proved more effective, demonstrating the advantages of speed, maneuverability, and structural adaptability. This led to a reevaluation of shipbuilding across Europe. Shipbuilders began to design vessels that balanced firepower with speed, stability, and endurance, incorporating innovations in hull design, rigging, and armament placement. Deck layouts were optimized to improve mobility of gunners and reduce vulnerability to enemy fire. The emphasis on maneuverability allowed smaller fleets to engage and outwit larger forces, altering traditional concepts of naval dominance. In the decades following the Armada, European navies increasingly invested in research and experimentation, resulting in ships that were faster, more resilient, and capable of extended campaigns. These technological developments laid the groundwork for the expansion of European maritime empires in the 17th and 18th centuries, allowing nations like England, the Netherlands, and France to project power across oceans and compete for global influence. The Armada's legacy in shipbuilding demonstrates how failure can inspire innovation, pushing nations to rethink conventional approaches and embrace new technological solutions. Beyond immediate tactical and technological lessons, the Armada's defeat offered enduring insights for naval doctrine. European powers learned the importance of integrating intelligence, weather awareness, logistical planning, and leadership into operational strategy. Coordination across fleets became a priority, as did communication, signaling systems, and contingency planning for unexpected developments. Commanders understood that adaptability and initiative were as crucial as strict adherence to hierarchical orders. Psychological factors, morale, leadership, and public perception were increasingly recognized as integral to naval success. Moreover, the Armada demonstrated the vulnerability of even the most powerful fleets to environmental hazards and the perils of overextension. As a result, European navies began to emphasize sustainability, supply chain management, and strategic flexibility in planning campaigns. The Spanish Armada's failure became a reference point in military literature, used as a case study for teaching command decisions, risk assessment, and the integration of human, material, and environmental factors. In sum, the Armada shaped the evolution of naval warfare, influencing ship design, strategic thinking, and operational practices for centuries. Its legacy extends beyond the 16th century, leaving a lasting imprint on the development of modern naval doctrine, European power projection, and the understanding of maritime conflict. The defeat of the Spanish Armada in 1588 had immediate repercussions for Spain's standing in Europe. Once seen as the uncontested military and maritime power of the continent, Spain now faced a dramatic loss of prestige. Rival European powers, particularly England, the Dutch Republic, and France, observed the failure with renewed confidence, prompting shifts in alliances and strategic calculations. Spain's inability to successfully project military power into England revealed vulnerabilities that other nations sought to exploit, both diplomatically and militarily. Philip II's dominance over the Low Countries came under increased scrutiny, and resistance movements in regions under Spanish influence were emboldened. The psychological impact of the defeat diminished the perception of Spanish invincibility, weakening the aura of fear that had previously allowed Spain to influence European affairs with minimal challenge. Politically, the monarchy had to reassure allies and vassals that the empire remained strong despite the setback, while internally addressing criticism of planning, leadership, and execution. This marked the beginning of a gradual but significant recalibration of Spain's role in European geopolitics, emphasizing the interplay between perception, credibility, and hard military capability. Beyond Europe, the Armada's failure affected Spain's overseas ambitions, particularly in the Americas and the Philippines. The enormous financial and material resources devoted to the Armada, funded in large part by American silver, strained Spain's ability to sustain other military and colonial endeavors. Plans to expand territorial control, protect trade routes, and enforce Catholic orthodoxy in distant colonies were hindered by reduced naval capacity and depleted finances. The loss of ships and men meant that Spain had fewer resources to defend colonies against local resistance, privateers, and emerging European competitors such as England and the Netherlands. Furthermore, news of the Armada's defeat undermined Spain's perceived authority among colonies, emboldening both indigenous resistance and rival colonial powers. This forced Spain to adopt a more cautious and defensive stance in its overseas policies, focusing on consolidating control rather than aggressive expansion. In essence, the defeat demonstrated the interdependence of European and colonial strategy, highlighting that setbacks in one theater could reverberate globally, affecting the empire's capacity to project power and maintain dominance across oceans. In the long term, the Armada's failure contributed to a gradual decline in Spain's supremacy as a global power. The defeat revealed structural weaknesses in the empire's administration, logistics, and military planning that would resurface in later conflicts. Spain's inability to project power effectively against a determined and well-prepared opponent created opportunities for England and the Netherlands to establish stronger naval and colonial presences. The psychological and economic consequences of the Armada's loss delayed Spain's ability to respond to emerging challenges, weakening its capacity to maintain influence over European affairs and overseas territories simultaneously. Over time, the empire's overstretch, coupled with rising rival powers, led to shifts in the balance of global influence. The Armada's defeat became a symbolic turning point, representing the limits of centralized, top-down power projection and the growing importance of adaptable, decentralized strategies in both European and colonial contexts. For Spain, the event was a painful reminder that vast resources and military might alone could not guarantee success against a combination of environmental challenges, agile adversaries, and strategic miscalculations. The Spanish Armada campaign of 1588 remains a timeless case study in the critical importance of logistics in military strategy. The Spanish effort to transport over 30,000 men, hundreds of tons of supplies, and nearly 130 ships across the unpredictable waters of the English Channel highlighted how logistical oversights can doom even the most formidable forces. Food, water, ammunition, and medical supplies were often insufficient, poorly stored, or delayed, directly undermining combat readiness. Modern military strategists study the Armada as a cautionary tale. Operational success is contingent upon meticulous planning for the movement, storage, and sustainability of resources. Logistics is no longer a supporting element but a core determinant of strategy. In modern terms, the campaign underscores that an army or navy is only as effective as its ability to maintain supply lines, adapt to environmental challenges, and anticipate disruptions. Modern planners apply these lessons to everything from expeditionary forces to joint operations, understanding that even technologically advanced and numerically superior forces can fail if logistical considerations are neglected. The Spanish Armada's failure demonstrates that operational brilliance cannot compensate for fundamental deficiencies in resource management and infrastructure planning. Another enduring lesson from the Armada concerns intelligence and communication. Sir Francis Walsingham's network of spies and informants allowed England to anticipate Spanish movements, positioning forces effectively and gaining a strategic advantage despite numerical inferiority. The campaign illustrates that accurate, timely, and secure intelligence can decisively alter the balance of power, a principle that remains central to modern military planning. In addition, the Armada highlighted the importance of flexible communication and the ability to adapt rapidly to changing conditions. Spanish commands suffered from rigid hierarchies, delayed information, and poor coordination, which compounded the effects of environmental challenges. Modern militaries recognize that agility, decentralized decision-making, and rapid dissemination of accurate information are crucial to operational success. The Armada's lessons inform the development of command and control structures, emphasizing redundancy, real-time intelligence sharing, and adaptive leadership. This has relevance in contemporary contexts ranging from naval warfare to combined arms operations, illustrating that technological superiority alone is insufficient without effective integration of information and adaptive response mechanisms. Leadership and morale were decisive factors in the outcome of the Armada campaign, offering another key lesson for modern military strategy. Queen Elizabeth I exemplified leadership that integrated strategic foresight, communication, and inspiration, uniting both military personnel and civilians in a shared sense of purpose. Conversely, the Spanish Armada's leadership, despite dedication and personal courage, struggled under pressure, hindered by inflexible plans, poor communication, and environmental adversity. Modern military studies emphasize that leadership under uncertainty, the cultivation of morale, and the management of psychological factors are as critical as equipment and tactics. The Armada campaign demonstrates that human factors, trust in leadership, confidence, and resilience under stress, can amplify or diminish the effectiveness of any force. Psychological operations, morale building, and the ability to exploit enemy uncertainty have become integral components of contemporary strategy, echoing the principles observed in the 16th century conflict. From this perspective, the Armada provides enduring guidance on the interplay between leadership, human psychology, and operational effectiveness, highlighting the timeless nature of these lessons in military science. The defeat of the Spanish Armada in 1588 marked a turning point in global naval history, signaling the rise of England as a dominant maritime power. Prior to the Armada, Spain had enjoyed near-absolute control over European seas, projecting its influence across both the Atlantic and Mediterranean. The failure of the Armada, however, demonstrated that even the largest fleet could be overcome by superior strategy, intelligence, and agility. England's naval approach, which emphasized smaller, faster ships, long-range artillery, and coordinated maneuvers, became a model for other nations seeking maritime supremacy. Over the ensuing decades, England leveraged this experience to expand its commercial and colonial reach, establishing early footholds in North America, the Caribbean, and India. The Armada's defeat underscored the importance of naval power as a tool of national influence, shaping how European states perceived security, trade, and international diplomacy. The campaign revealed that sea power required not only the quantity of ships but the quality of strategy, adaptability to environmental conditions, and innovative tactics. This lesson reverberated worldwide, influencing naval doctrines and inspiring future maritime empires. In many ways, the Armada's legacy set the stage for England's evolution into a global naval power, with lasting implications for trade, exploration, and colonial expansion. The Armada's defeat had far-reaching diplomatic and geopolitical consequences. European powers reassessed alliances, military commitments, and political strategies in response to Spain's weakened prestige. Protestant states, particularly the Dutch Republic, were emboldened to resist Spanish influence, accelerating their fight for independence. England's enhanced status allowed it to negotiate from a position of strength in Europe and to cultivate strategic alliances, further expanding its influence. The failure of the Armada also served as a cautionary tale for other monarchs contemplating large-scale invasions, highlighting the risks of overextension, logistical mismanagement, and underestimating opponents. Beyond Europe, the event influenced colonial ambitions. Spain had to adopt a more defensive posture in its overseas territories, while England and the Netherlands seized opportunities to challenge Spanish monopoly over trade routes and territories. The geopolitical ripple effects of the Armada's defeat underscore how a single military campaign can have enduring consequences for international relations, reshaping power balances and influencing policy decisions for decades. In this sense, the Armada's legacy is not confined to naval history. It is a defining moment in the evolution of early modern geopolitics and the dynamics of empire building. The Spanish Armada's legacy extends beyond strategy and geopolitics into historical memory and cultural identity. In England, the Armada became a symbol of national resilience, divine favor, and military ingenuity, celebrated in literature, art, public ceremonies, and patriotic narratives. Figures such as Elizabeth I, Sir Francis Drake, and Lord Howard were immortalized as embodiments of courage, strategy, and leadership. In Spain, the Armada was remembered as a noble, though tragic, effort, highlighting loyalty, sacrifice, and the unpredictability of nature. Across Europe, the event served as a cautionary example of the limits of power and the importance of adaptive strategy. Over centuries, the Armada has been studied in military academies, commemorated in national histories, and referenced in discussions of leadership, logistics, and naval warfare. Its cultural resonance underscores how historical events can transcend their immediate outcomes, shaping national identity, collective memory, and strategic thinking for generations. Ultimately, the Spanish Armada is remembered not merely as a failed invasion, but as a transformative event that influenced the trajectory of naval power, empire, and global history, leaving an enduring legacy on the world stage. And that concludes our in-depth journey through the Spanish Armada of 1588. Today, we saw how leadership, strategy, intelligence, and even the weather can turn the tide of history. From Elizabeth I's brilliant foresight to the challenges faced by Medina Sidonia, we learned that success depends on preparation, adaptability, and courage, even against overwhelming odds. The moral of the story? Size and power alone do not guarantee victory. Strategy, innovation, and resilience are what make history. If you enjoyed this deep dive, make sure to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you never miss another epic journey through history. We'll continue uncovering fascinating stories, secrets, and lessons from the past right here on History Teller YT. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next adventure through time.